So we're going to be making 10 candles today, and we're going to measure out the wax to do that with. And so I got my scale here. This is 100% soy wax in solid form. I tear the scale here, and then I just scoop it. Okay. Once I scoop it, I'm going to use this and get some off the sides because those will contribute to the weight on the scale but not actually make it into the pot. So I got to make sure that there's no stragglers. There, where are we at? So we're at 1.01, so I got almost the exact right amount. So I'm going to take off a little bit to get it to a perfect pound. And then from there, take the wax and we're going to load it into one of our pots here. They can hold 4 pounds of wax in liquid form. But in solid form, they can only hold about 2. So to make 5 candles with the size containers I'm using, I need to use 3 pounds of wax to make 5 candles. And so because only 2 pounds in solid form fit, I will pour 2 in, and then as it melts down, I'll add in the 3rd pound. So very gradually pour the wax in, and my hands kind of act as a barrier to catch any pieces that might fall outside. I'll use my little scooper here if you use your fingers, the moisture and warmth of your fingers can actually kind of be sticky on the flakes, so it's better instead to use a tool. Get about as much of that as we can. So do another big scoop, get off the stragglers. Just a little more here. Don't lose any flakes. I'm going to start melting this down. And once it gets farther down, then I'll add an additional pound. We're going to melt this down on the stove. However, we don't want to put direct heat on the pitcher that has the wax in it because it'll melt too rapidly. And the wax has a really low flash point. And so if it melts too rapidly, it could actually catch on fire. In order to put indirect heat on it, what we're going to do is we're going to put just about an inch of water in this pot, putting the pitcher full of wax in this pot. And this is called a double broiler effect. So from there, we're going to turn the heat on. We're going to go very low heat. We want it to melt gradually to keep the temperature low. If we could put it on high heat and get it done a lot faster, however, we'd have to wait for it to cool before we could add fragrance and dye and do the pouring. Because if it was too hot, it'll burn all the fragrance off when we add the oils in. So it's kind of about finding a balance. So I keep it pretty low heat. And so this will melt down over the next half hour to an hour. So we're going to get started on a second one now. Same process. And this, by staggering them like this, by starting one and then doing another, we're staggering it so that I can, once this one's ready to pour, that'll give me enough time to pour it, and then right around when we're done with that, we'll be ready to pour the next batch. So it's good to kind of stagger them out instead of starting them all at once. So now we get to wait a little bit, but while we do that, we can actually get the containers ready to go. We're going to be pouring into, these are just essentially just whiskey glasses. So a great thing about this is after you use one of these candles, once you burn it to the end, you can clean it out, and then you got a new whiskey glass. So we've got our wicks. There's many different sizes of wick, and so it's really important to pick the right size, because if you pick one that's too small, when you burn your candle, it won't burn to the edge, and it'll just gradually form a crater, and you'll get a ton of wax that gets wasted and doesn't get used. At the same time, if you have a wick that's too big, it can burn too rapidly and can make a lot of soot and smoke. And it'll really not make the candle perform how it's supposed to. So what we do, we've got these little sticky pads, and stick one side on the bottom here, peel this side off. It's a double-sided stick, and then do my best to get this as centered as possible. So after I've already stuck my wick in, we're going to use these little kind of braces, and they've got a little indent here, and you pull the wick as taut as you can without pulling it off, and then you catch the brace on the wick, and then it's going to hold that wick really tight and be nice and centered and be ready to go, so that once we pour it in, it's going to hold the wick in place in center even after the hot liquid goes in there. I'm going to take a break real quick and just check on my wax, see where it's at. These are getting low enough now that I can add that 1/3 pound of wax to each one. So we've been melting down 3 pounds of wax in each pitcher, and this one is done, liquefied, and this one's almost there. And so now that it's liquefied, we turn the burner off and we're going to let it cool. It's at around somewhere between 160 to 180 degrees right now, and that's as high as we want it to get. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add our dye. This is liquid dye, and we just add 3 to 6 drops per pound. And so since this is 3, soy wax doesn't retain color well. You have to add a lot of dye to make a dark color, and I don't want to add that much dye because it can actually detract from the fragrance. So my colors usually turn out very pastel, very light, and that's okay with me. We're working on a candle that's going to be a grapefruit and honeysuckle combo for this one. So we're adding a magenta dye, and I'm going to count out 15. And we're going to stir this in. It's going to look a lot darker in liquid form than it's actually going to once it finishes in the candles. Now, time to add our fragrance oils. So the general rule for adding fragrance to wax when you're making candles is that you're going to use 1 ounce of liquid fragrance per pound of wax used. So we used 3 pounds in this batch, so we're going to use roughly 3 ounces. And 2 tablespoons equals 1 ounce. Now I'm actually going to go a little bit more than the average, than that general rule, just to add a little bit more strength to this. So we're making a combo that's going to be 2/3 grapefruit and mangosteen. This is, again, essential oils and synthetic oils mixed together. And so it's going to be mostly a grapefruit scent with a little bit of mangosteen. If you've never heard of mangosteen, it's a fruit from Southeast Asia that I hear is wonderful. And 1/3 honeysuckle oils. Normally I would be doing 6 tablespoons total. I'm going to go 8. So 4 or 6 of this and then 2 of the other one. So I'm stirring the fragrance in, making sure it all gets integrated well with the wax and the dye. Just want it to really become cohesive. Everything blended well. Now finally, we've got our dye in and we've got our fragrance in. We need to measure the temperature. For the best pour, we want to pour at 125 degrees. I'd say this one's ready to pour. Yeah. So now it's time to pour, and we're going to fill almost all the way, but we have to save a little bit to top off the candles after they've dried, so that we can make sure they have a smooth top, or as smooth top as we can get them. So the last thing you do after you pour is you got to straighten the wicks, and just because however they set, that's where the wick's going to be stuck. So we did it earlier when we put the bars in place, but it's just really good at this point to double check and make sure your wicks are truly centered. Because again, once they solidify, that's where they're staying. And you don't want a crooked wick or else they'll burn really unevenly. Basically, what happens is as the candle cools, after it pours, it solidifies and certain parts turn solid before others. And it all kind of settles in towards the center. And what this can result in is a very rough surface that is very, frankly, ugly. It just looks really unsightly and it looks like somebody took a big bite out of it or something like that. After they've dried, we just pour to fill in all those holes. And it's going to fill in all those little ridges and bumps and crevices, and that's what produces the bubbles, is as the liquid fills in the crevices and such, it pushes all the air out and really fills in every nook and cranny. And that's how we do a top off. And so now those will end up finishing and drying with a much smoother top than they would have had before. So that's the basics of how you make candles. Once they're done, you trim the wicks, and then they're ready to label, and we're good to go.